April 23rd, SDS called a demonstration in which we plan to demonstrate inside Low Library to protest Columbia's complicity with the Institute for Defense Analysis, its racism in building the gym in Morningside Park, and its attempted suppression of the left by disciplining 6 students. About 500 people joined us at the Sundial.
It's been 2 days. We've taken 5 buildings: Hamilton, Low, Avery, Fairweather, and Matt. If we've got the administration figured right, they're up to calling the cops. And when they do, we want to be here.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Bredos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College and Yeshiva University here in New York. 1968 is often referred to as a watershed year for progressive radical forces around the world and in the United States. The apex of the movement of the 1960s that also signaled the beginning of the chaos that would soon engulf the left. We at the Radical Imagination see it more as Reverend William Barber of the New Poor People's Campaign has put it. Martin King isn't going to get up again. The old labor leaders aren't going to come to life again. It's not about commemorating so much as passing the baton and getting on with the unfinished business of transforming the world. We need to become long-distance runners for a world of peace and justice. 50 years ago, on April 23rd, 1968, hundreds of students at Columbia University in New York started a revolt on campus in which they occupied and barricaded themselves inside 5 buildings, protesting Columbia's ties to military research, aiding the Vietnam War, and plans to build a Jim Crow Ivy League version of a university gymnasium in a public park overlooking Harlem against the will of the people of the community. The protests, occupations, and subsequent New York City's police department's tactical police force busts and arrests on April 30th of more than 700 people, the largest mass arrest in New York City history, inspired student protests across the country and occurred less than 3 weeks after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th. Columbia protests were seen as a high point of the campus movement against the Vietnam War. Quoting the student radicals, "We demand an end to all affiliation and ties with the Institute for Defense Analysis, a Department of Defense venture that collaborated the university into studies of kill and overkill that resulted in the slaughter and maiming of thousands of Vietnamese and Americans." The attempts to radicalize the Columbia campus in 1968 had and continues to have profound implications and consequences for political and cultural struggle in the country today. Many of the same issues student radicals attempted to confront still exist in a variety of forms and permutations, and in even more troublesome and seemingly intractable ways. In literally 3 weeks, on May 14th, 2018, there will be another 50th year anniversary. There will be simultaneous, nonviolent civil disobedience actions in 30 to 40 state capitals in Washington, D.C., as a new Poor People's Campaign seeks to carry on the struggle Martin Luther King initiated 50 years ago. This will be the first time in American history that a movement has attempted to accomplish such simultaneous direct actions, raise political consciousness, and dramatize the plight of America's poor of all races. And it will continue for 6 weeks of direct action, culminating in a mass gathering in Washington on June 23rd, and continue from then on for as long as it takes. As King put it, and as the baton is passed to Reverend William Barber, after Selma and the Voting Rights Bill, we moved into a new era, which must be an era of revolution. In short, we've moved into an era where we are called upon to raise certain basic questions about the whole society. In that sense, 1968 and the Columbia Uprising got it right. As we continue in a variety of ways, to move ahead from the era of civil rights to the era of human rights, where there must be a radical redistribution of economic and political power and an end to poverty, racism, militarism, excessive materialism, and ecological devastation. Today on the show, we're proud to have two leading long-distance runners on the radical imagination who've been passing batons their entire lives and continue to do so with even greater commitment and fervor than they had 50 years ago. We're joined by Ray Brown on the show. He's the former leader of the Student Afro-American Society at Columbia, one of the leaders of the black students who occupied Columbia University's Hamilton Hall. He's now a prominent criminal defense lawyer who also practices international human rights law. And we're also joined by Todd Gitlin, who is the former president of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, from 1963 to 1964, the group that helped organize the protests. Todd is now a professor of journalism and sociology and chair of the PhD program in communication at Columbia. He's written widely on politics, intellectual life, and the arts, has been an internal critic of the American left through his classic work, The 60s, Years of Hope, Days of Rage, and most recently, Occupy Nation, The Roots, the Spirit, and the Promise of Occupy Wall Street. Welcome both.
Good to be here.
To the Radical Imagination. It's great to have you on. And we need so much to talk about this incredible event 50 years ago, the Columbia Uprising. And Ray, you were the leader of the African-American students who took over one of the buildings. Give us a little bit of a background here, what was going on in campus.
Let me clarify it by saying I was a leader and that we very much moved by consensus. But
absolutely.
That
okay.
aside,
You
and to
got
talk about that day, of course, is to, for the moment, forget the long history that leads up to it in terms of our relationships with the Harlem community and our role as part of a much larger movement. But for the moment, the 23rd. Mm-hmm. The night before, there'd actually been some discussions, and to my recollection, many people said students are tired, demoralized, they just want to graduate and go home. There was going to be a rally at the Sundial just to talk about this IDA, the Institute for Defense Analysis, and the university's determination, despite many protests, to build a gym in Morningside Park. There was a rally at the Sundial. A number of people spoke. Cicero Wilson, who was the new leader of SAS, spoke. A number of other people spoke, SAS, other groups. And to show the role of provocateurs, somebody said, let's go to Low Library, which was the main administrative building.
Right.
So the crowd moves towards Low Library, which the security personnel immediately locked down. So there wasn't much that could happen. Another voice, and some people claim they know who these voices were. Some people claim they were women's voices, said, let's go to the gym site. And so everybody went to the gym site, where there was a scuffle with some policemen. There was a big hole in the ground and some bulldozers and a fence. The fence was dismantled.
Morningside Drive, yeah.
Yeah, and at right in the park site, which was a big
right.
hole there.
Got it.
And there was a scuffle. As I recall it, an old police sergeant sort of broke it up, and I don't think anybody was arrested. And somebody else said, let's go to Hamilton Hall. I don't know who that voice was. Back to Hamilton Hall, everybody goes, and there is a series of teach-ins. An ad hoc steering committee is formed. I was on it, Bill Sales.
Which is, Hamilton Hall was again, the
It was
center
the
of the
main
administrative...
it was the main building for the college.
For the college.
Most of the college's
Right.
classes, though not all, were held there.
Exactly.
So it would be the main place that most students have to go to. Several of the dean's offices were there.
Exactly.
So it was the main administrative hub for the college. In the lobby were just hundreds of students milling around talking. Very quickly, the African-American students, who had as a group been working together for years, went upstairs and started holding our own meeting. And we were better disciplined than the other groups. We weren't homogenous, but we were cohesive. And we decided we wanted to keep that building. And we decided we would best keep it ourselves. So myself and Bill Sales and several others were delegated to talk to Mark Rudd and Ted Gold and some others and tell them that we were going to hold the building.
Because the white students were there with you.
The white,
At that
everybody
point-
was
at that point,
there.
right,
It was
there.
a mixture.
And then-
It was a big
so a decision
teach-in.
had to be made, right.
But we went up separately and had our own meeting.
Got it.
Then
Okay.
we were delegated, several of us, to go talk to Rudd and Ted Gold. I'm deliberately using names that will be known to some of your viewers who studied this era. I think Juan was there. And we had contemplated
Juan
what...
Gonzalez from Democracy Now!
Right.
Yeah.
What will happen if they say no? But we said, no, they won't say no. And we went down, and they were a little taken aback. We said, we're going to hold this building. And I remember Sales saying, take some other buildings. And so they left.
To the
Now,
yeah.
years later, it has turned out there is much residual bitterness and angst over that moment. But it was a critical moment because we knew what we were facing. We knew eventually there were likely to be arrests. We had all agreed on what the demands were, especially these two critical demands about the gym and the IDA.
Right.
And we were determined to control our own destiny, which we then did for 8 days. We were the pivotal force. One of the things that's been lost in the welter of history and reconstruction is that without black students, it wouldn't have lasted 8 days, because we had tremendous support from the community, a community that had just risen 3 weeks earlier in response to Dr. King's death. We had visible community support from people we'd worked with, HARUAC, the West Harlem Community Organization, many others. And we had visible support from blacks in the power structure here and around the country who came and visited us and supported us. We were the pivot point around which the entire demonstration
And now that's
evolved.
become more and more realized.
This year it's been acknowledged more. And Mark Rudd, to be fair, who became, wittingly or otherwise, the symbol that the press and the media loved, has been among the people saying that this is true. He had an op-ed in the Times recently. But we've been continually sounding the horn for 50 years, saying, why does this get pictured as a wild left-wing revolt, when in fact at the core of it were some very disciplined people who knew it wasn't the revolution, although we did get a telegram from Chairman Mao. We always thought it was odd that Chairman Mao knew we were there, but he knew
personal phone, right? No.
But we didn't have cell phones. We got a telegram from Chairman Mao congratulating the black students of Hamilton Hall on our pivotal role. Now, how did Chairman Mao know that and the New York Times didn't? That's a continuing mystery and maybe a piece of irony. But in any event, we think our role was pivotal. We know it's been ignored. We're not unaccustomed to history not being written in a way that reflects the role of black folks. But that's a short version of a much longer tale that we could talk about.
Now, you're part of you weren't at Columbia at this time.
I was not.
But you were you were the second president of SDS? Third, okay, 1963-64. So you had something to do with what? The intellectual underpinnings or strategizing, forming the organization that eventually attempted to carry on a radicalization of campus and so on. So what were you doing at that time, and how were you preparing? Or what was your role in all of this at that point?
So I was living in San Francisco worrying.
Worrying?
Worrying.
Okay.
I was working for an underground
okay.
newspaper, as we called them then, the San Francisco Express-Times.
Okay.
I was involved in various movement enterprises, anti-war activities of different kinds. I was writing. And when I say I was worrying, I was also monitoring the trajectory of the white New Left unhappily. Because I felt the imperative that was in the air. I felt that revolutionary zeal or aspiration or delusion that many felt. I felt it as an emotional force, but at the same time, I feared it was heading toward disaster, toward either massacre or something like fascism. So
this was
one thing that interests me.
64.
Sorry?
This was early on.
No, I'm talking about 68.
Oh, 68, okay.
Yeah,
good.
no,
Okay,
I mean,
all right.
we don't have time to talk about
okay, all right. But
the
you
four
saw
intervening
this
years.
happening in
I felt that the revolutionary
recently saw it
spirit
too. Yeah.
that Ray alluded to as the sort of prevailing métier of the white left was delusional. I wouldn't have put it that starkly, maybe because I was afraid to put it that starkly, because I was going against a wind, a tide. But I was struck by one thing you said, Ray, about how you guys, when you were on the way into Hamilton Hall and during that night, you were talking and strategizing. Right. So you guys were operating in, I think, the right spirit. That is to say, so what does it mean to strategize? So I think this is what generals do. I've never been in war, but I think this is generals, nonviolent or violent, do. You size up the situation. Okay, so who are we? What do we mobilize? Who are they? Who's the enemy? Who might be neutralized? Who can we count on? Who can we not count on? If we do X, what will they do? And then when they do Y, what will we do? So that's all goes with strategizing. And I think, the genius of the civil rights movement for so many years was that it conducted so many acts of hard-headed appraisal. It was of course a deeply moral and a movement animated by music and religious belief and passion, but it was also strategic. If you look,
Would you agree with
we
that?
were very self-conscious that we were children of that movement. We were literally children of that movement, to the extent that that movement was fueled initially by World War II veterans coming back.
Right.
Harry Truman desegregating the armed forces because he sees that black GIs are being lynched.
Right.
The tales of my father and his cohorts who came back were more of fighting white GIs, including pitched battles in Europe, than it was of fighting the enemy, the Germans. So we were schooled. I had been on picket lines with my father. Other members of the group had walked on picket lines. Bill Sales was from Philly, where there was an active movement against Tasty Cake, against the Philadelphia police. So we had at least some people who were self-conscious as being children of that movement. In addition, we'd spent years talking to James Bevel, to Cortland Cox, to people who were in that movement, who came, spent time with us, talked to us, James Baldwin and others, and we had engaged with the community. We were
And the
actively
Black
engaged.
Church.
Oh, the Black Church was
Absolutely,
critical.
was central.
And we had engaged with the West Harlem Community Organization,
Right.
HARU Act, and other organizations. So we were very conscious of that. And to some extent, we'd been trained for this. We had studied counterinsurgency movements. We had met with police from the New York Police Department, some of whom came to arrest us at earlier points to say, how do police function in demonstrations? What do you do to make sure you don't get your head split open? What do you do to minimize getting arrested if you don't plan to get arrested? What do you do to be a nonviolent participant? While at the same time, we're debating about the ethics and the practicality of nonviolence. So we were talking about these things for years. When the moment came, this was our discourse, and the first distinction we made in our minds was, this is not the revolution, it's a demonstration.
So, and as you said
Right.
before, you were also mindful of who were the politicians in the community.
Exactly.
Could you count on them? And
We
so
reached out to
on.
Bill Booth, who was chair of the Human Rights Commission, because we wanted monitors when the arrests came, that kind of thing.
So I want to congratulate you retroactively in acting politically with your intelligence. By contrast, I think SGS at that point was swept up in a kind of hallucination about the revolution.
Posturing.
And so, sorry?
Posturing.
Well, I mean, it was
Would you say-
sincere.
It was sincere.
It was sincere, and it was
Idealistic,
heartfelt, and without.
heartfelt.
I mean, certainly the war was loathsome, and the fact that
Okay.
military research was being done on the campus, stuck in a lot of throats and deserved to. But the fight against the gym had a concreteness that was lacking on the white left. The white left hated the war, wanted
And
to do
also,
something about the war.
When you talk, we were aware that night, for example, that talking about white students is unfair, but not to get into a detailed discussion of whiteness. There were SDSers, there were Leninists, there were kids who had no ideological perspective at all, but just had been demoralized by Columbia's response to students. There were a wide range of people, and what we could see was that there wasn't any strategizing at all going on. There were people who wanted to teach in, there were people who wanted to smoke reefer, there were people who wanted to make love, there were people who were talking politically, but it wasn't something that we thought was viable going forward.
So the thing is that we now know that, in fact, it was right to doubt that this was a revolutionary moment.
Right.
I have come around to thinking, after reflection on this for many years, that 1968 is not so much a beginning as an end. It's the end of a reform moment, which in various permutations lasted from the beginning of the New Deal through most of the 60s, and was then ruined by Lyndon Johnson's war, and eventually the gathering of the counter-revolution. The counter-revolution, which we're still in, was actually better organized, more clear-headed, better equipped, and more sober-minded about its prospects.
Destroyed organized
than the
labor
left.
as a
They-
bulwark.
Nixon and
Well, you
Starting
have
with
and the
Nixon's
war on
Southern
drugs and the war
strategy.
on crime. You have the Southern strategy, which
Right.
brings
Right.
the reactionary elements of the Democratic
Right.
Party and the racist elements into the Republican Party. You have the destruction. I mean, it's not an accident that Reagan's first act is to destroy a labor union. I mean, it maximizes, and it begins a period of incredible inequality in American life, in which wealth is increasingly concentrated in smaller and smaller hands, and civil society elements that could challenge it are neutralized or destroyed. That's why organized labor is so important.
This is what seems to be so important when we think back on these events. I don't think back on them strictly in a celebratory spirit. I also think back on them as warnings. about what happens when you get the situation wrong. It was not a revolutionary situation. By the way, even in France, which looked on television like a revolutionary situation, it was not. The uprising in France, it took place exactly 50 years ago this week, was followed by an election that was won by the right. And the reason it was won by the right was that even the workers who went out on strike were not striking to harmonize with the anarchist students. They were striking in behalf of ordinary union demands, which were just, but they were not in a revolutionary mood. Most of the country, most of France was panicked and just wanted to restore order. But coming back to the US, I think that the delusion that this was a revolutionary moment impaired the ability of the growing movements to get serious about what they needed to have in place in order to function. So it's one of the terrible, I think, ironic but true consequences of that whole wave of confrontations in 1968 and thereafter. The outcome was the election of Richard Nixon, the pursuit of the war for more than 7 more years. More people were killed in Vietnam, more Americans and Vietnamese killed in Vietnam while Nixon was president than under Kennedy and Johnson before them. So I think that the reason I think is important to properly appraise what happened in 1968 is in order to save ourselves from illusion. Illusion is the enemy of progress.
But I think there's a distinction between what happened on the left, and an area in which I'm not an expert but just an observer, and what happened within what we call the civil rights movement. The war created a tremendous crisis. Lyndon Johnson, who had in fact been a supporter of the Voting Rights Act, who had been a reluctant architect of the Atlantic City movement, that actually the Mississippi Freedom movement of changing the Democratic Party and finally driving the South into the arms of the Republican Party. Those were pivotal moments. And remember, King in '67, in a way, created a kind of mini crisis within what we call the leadership of the civil rights movement by coming to Riverside and denouncing the war and beginning to talk about human rights, about militarism, about poverty, and about class issues. And so it was inevitable that a movement that had started out, remember, at the end of World War II, and I would, maybe quarrel with you a few years about whether the New Deal marks the end of an old era or a new one, because lynching was still... No, I mean, we can debate that over a beer.
Checkered record.
Right. I think we'd have an interesting debate, probably not worth having it here. The reason I mentioned the distinction is, end of World War II, lynching is still a paramount concern to what we now call the civil rights movement. Within 20 years, it's been transformed as a movement for civil rights in a literal sense, the right to vote, the right to have fair employment practices. So the nature of education, which had been a driving force coming out of that era and culminating in Brown. So you have a movement that has a somewhat different arc than the movement of the left. It's why, there was a convergence in '68 of many forces, but in many ways they were, I would like to claim that we were brilliant and geniuses, that we recognized it was a demonstration and the kids on the left didn't. But I think it was that we were the product of a different set of forces. 1964, which is when my class came to Columbia, we were literally the children of Brown versus Board of Education. Well, the Supreme Court didn't order us to be brought there. The fact of the matter is, the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education did little to desegregate schools. What it was a death knell to white supremacy as an official government doctrine. And remember, that was done largely because of the Cold War. The United States filed an amicus brief in Brown versus Board of Education, which says, we can't argue to the colored peoples of the world they should be with us and not the communists if we openly segregate and discriminate against our brown citizens at home. So there was sort of some cold calculations about economics and about influence in the world that the United States was making.
And the cold calculation was, how many black students were at Columbia when you started in '64?
There were maybe 5 or 6 or 7. My class had 20. Which was a sea change, and by the time of the arrest, we had 80 students who got arrested. So that's a sea change in terms of the dynamics of the school. The school, of course, was totally unprepared They thought we'd be little white kids with brown faces. Little did they know that we would be nagging them and harassing them about every issue, from being stopped every time we went off campus and came back by the security guards, who themselves were often people of color, but didn't really accept that we really belonged, to a curriculum that, except for people like James Shenton, who gave sparkling lectures about Black Reconstruction, didn't recognize Black history, didn't recognize who we were, and an intellectual environment that was at the same time liberating and oppressive. You couldn't walk across the campus and not talk about Marcuse or Marx, or more importantly, Fanon. You could meet the man who became Imam Baraka, and later spoke at my wedding, was an ally of my father's, but was then Leroy Jones at the West End. You could have all kinds of discourse, but Jacques Barzun, the early time provost and a symbol of Western culture, refused to meet with us. David Truman met with us, made us empty promises, and nothing ever happened because they didn't take us seriously as a voice within that community. And we, by and large, moved outward. There was, for example, a Black fraternity formed on campus. I wasn't a part of it. I sort of frowned on fraternity life, but it turned out the Omega Psi Phi fraternity that formed on Columbia was a heavily political group. These guys were guys who were concerned about the war, concerned about the gym, and were one of the bulwarks of what happened in Hamilton Hall. So our social life looked outside the university to other parts of the community. Our political life was outwardly looking. And to the extent that we looked at inward, we saw there was a strike of cafeteria workers that took place for 5 years at the university, mainly CORE and other groups that helped to support the workers, largely Black workers. The university wouldn't even resolve it. So you had a university that holds itself out as this paragon of Western virtue, but is in fact at best oblivious to its obligation to be open to the very community it says it wants to embrace by the symbolic act of admitting us.
And yet professionally you were disciplined enough, realizing you need to play part of that game, right?
Okay.
To get it. So that was the situation you were in. So, yeah. go
I
ahead,
would
Todd.
just add
Yeah.
one element, which you know very well, that when the university set out to build a gym in Morningside Park, what an insult.
Yeah.
What an insult. I mean, that they were so stupid and contemptuous of Black people that they didn't even get the symbolism.
Right.
The obvious
It's not like
symbolism.
there are great green
It's the back
spaces
door.
throughout Harlem.
I know,
Right.
right. And you know, okay, you people get the back door. I mean,
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a measure of
And
their
that this
the
university had
primitiveness
power
of their thinking.
that we didn't understand. I'm sorry to interrupt you,
No,
but,
no.
but one of the things that we learned was, the university has alumni in the legislature. It had a close tie to the New York Times, which is why the coverage was so distorted. It had relationships with the DA's office. I mean, this is a powerful institution. And as you peel back the layers, you see that what looks to be, I hate to use a Reagan metaphor, but it goes back and forth, a shining city on the hill intellectually. It is, in fact, that goes back to your Puritan fathers. But it turns out, I'm just kidding, that it turns out to be a place that, while it does have this capacity to generate great intellectual discourse, a power center that exerts its power against the wretched of the earth. And that's something that we couldn't stomach, especially since those were people
But
of color.
you said a few minutes ago something I think very important also that distinguishes you from the SDS mood at the time. Like I don't think you wanted to destroy Columbia University.
No.
All right.
No.
You wanted to reform it.
Half of our kids were first generation to ever go to college. They weren't interested in
Whereas
destroying it.
in what was well on its way to becoming the crazy left, they were indifferent. You know, so there were, famous moments of dialogue where professors said, well, do you really think that the university is worthless? I mean, you don't think it's an ambiguous thing? You think it's a diabolical thing? And, the leadership of SDS said, yes, they're part of the system. Well, they were on their way into the destructive and self-destructive literal explosions that ended the student movement in the 1960s.
Well, something you said earlier
and
about
it had
seeing
to do
things,
with delusion.
seeing things as they really are.
Yeah.
Because we were in a situation where, for example, we reached out to, how is it none of our people were injured? We reached out to the NACP, we reached out to the, these are not radical organizations, the Human Rights Commission in New York. We said, we want you here when there's going to be an arrest. We told the police we had no weapons. And we told them we
Because
expected we'd be right.
you weren't playing out a shadow theatrical game. You were doing real politics.
I agree. And so imagine this now on the eve of the decision to ask the white students to leave. We see ourselves as self-consciously working with these elements and our own divisions within. And we could, and we engaged in
What were
would
some
now
of
be
those
called-
divisions within? Just
Well,
briefly.
first of all, we had a left-right spectrum. There were those of us who were more progressive in our politics. I knew Rudd and STS people I would never have joined, but I knew them, went to their meetings sometimes. There were people who were more conservative. Cicero Wilson, the president, the incoming president, and the head of the line of the Qs was politically conservative. We had folks who were deeply religious. We had many kids who were first generation who had never been to school before. That phone was ringing in Hamilton Hall with parents saying, get your brown butt out of that place where I'm paying this tuition to survive. You had athletes who traditionally have been very conservative at most universities, but who had been so mistreated by the athletic department, it had actually radicalized them. They would all come in and be stacked at the same position, so only one of them could be on the field at a given time. So there were all kinds of people with different perspectives. We had people who were serious Christians, those who were not, those who were more militant in terms of their political ideology, and we had some people who were, so we had a whole spectrum of people, a whole spectrum of classes, a whole spectrum, and when you have a group of 80 people who deal with each other all the time, people don't like each other, you have all kinds of issues. Yeah. And those issues were surpassed because of what held us together, which was a common view of ourselves as being part of a larger movement, but also understanding this was a demonstration, and one in which we were taking some big chances and facing a superior force and had to marshal everything we could. So when Stokely Carmichael and Rat Brown came, they came in and they said, you guys realize this could be the bluff of the century. We don't know what the community is going to do, but we know everybody's afraid about what they'll do. You tell us what to say. Basil Patterson.
Because again, King had been assassinated
right, 3 weeks ago.
earlier.
Basil Patterson, borough president, borough president. Charles Rangel, a big muckety-muck in the assembly, and the state senator. They came by and they said the same thing. We don't know what the community will do. We know people are concerned about it, but don't do anything stupid, but we'll protect you. So we deliberately built a cocoon around us saying, well, we get arrested, if it happens, comes to that, we don't want our people to be injured. We're going to act in a certain way. And here's an element of what's now called respectability politics. We showered every day. The building was cleaner when we left than when we found it, which some people might find to be some kind of gesture in the direction of property rights.
Bourgeois.
But was exactly, and people said it, but we said we're disciplined, and that was something else that distinguished us from the mass of white students, which was they didn't seem focused on being disciplined from top to bottom. I mean, it's something of a cliche.
That's because it was a revolt against discipline.
Well,
and a revolt against discipline is good for certain purposes.
The other side of this is there was an alliance. We communicated with the other buildings through the tunnels.
Let's get into that.
They came to us every day. The mayor sent people, the president sent people, the academics sent people designed to say, well, will you take this compromise? Will you and we said, we're not, we've joined with the others in, these are our demands. We're not compromising on the demands. So our discipline and our unwillingness to hang NLF flags out doesn't mean
you're
we're
not communicating with your
it was what
allies
strategic alliances are.
Right.
We didn't create a mixture. We couldn't have held 80 black students in a place with white students crawling up. And the white students had not been particularly sensitive to our issues over the years, so there were all kinds of tensions.
Right.
But having made a commitment, we had no problem living to our commitment, and we didn't abandon anybody. And they understood by the second day that we were the key element, and they said Ted Keel. They said Davidoff and Goddard and all those people came. They sent academics that we knew. They tried to send athletic department people, though we wouldn't talk to them. And they all said the same thing. We'll set up a committee, we'll set up a commission, we'll study the idea. We said, look, our demands are simple and straightforward. And we told the other buildings what was happening. So we understood the distinctions and the similarities. We understood the nature of an alliance because we understood that Orangeburg had happened not long ago in which our black students had been killed. Jackson State was to happen shortly thereafter. We understood the stakes for us were pretty. The stakes for us were pretty high. And I don't mean to talk so much, but
no, go ahead.
The distinction that Professor makes is an interesting one because there was a convergence. We were there at the same time, and maybe in the zeitgeist there was a connection. But we had a different mission and a different sense of what we could have.
Can I sharpen that point by putting it even in a more polemical way? You guys were out to win. And what you wanted to win was concrete. You want the gym stopped.
And it was.
You want admissions.
We did win.
Yeah, right. I know. The New Left was now caught. The leadership of the New Left by this time was caught in what I'm calling a delusionary or a hallucinatory symbolic theater venture. And politics is for winning. I know that sounds, hard-assed, but I think it's true. And this is why it still makes sense to talk about 1968. I mean, I often think, this is crazy. We're in 2018. We're talking intensely about events of 50 years ago. Was anybody sitting around in 1968 debating the events of 1918? let alone listening to the
Well,
music.
there were elements on the left talking about 1919
Yeah, but-
and 1917.
Yeah, that's true.
That's
but
where
they
they
were
were.
crank.
They
They were
stayed there.
marginal
Right.
and
I agree.
crank.
I
So
agree.
why
That
are
was
we-
unfair.
Why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about
Exactly.
this? And I think
Yes.
that one reason, yeah, we have, we're sort of nostalgic for our youth in various ways. But I think another reason why we're talking about it is that the central questions that were generated in the 1960s
Exactly.
are
Are still
still
there.
our central questions. So the question of what you do strategically in order to fight against racism, what you do in order to prevent the further erosion of democracy,
Exactly.
what you do to resist crazy wars, these are all salient. So we're looking to the 60s not simply, and I'd say not primarily out of a sense of wasn't it wonderful to be young, but out of a sense that we need to win.
Right. I agree and I disagree. I think in this sense, there's a further look back, and this is how I will say that. My grandfather came to Jersey City in the turn of the last century, a step ahead of a lynch mob, because his wife, who was my grandmother, was educated by the standards of her day, had a high school education, and didn't want him to be paid just in the commissary from the logging system that he worked in. He rode logs down the Clench River. And so they were forming a lynch mob to lynch him and two other men whose wives had gone and said, we want them paid in cash, not commissary privileges. So they were told him to go to Jacksonville and get off at the first stop after Baltimore. So they stowed away on a freighter and wound up in Jersey City. My grandfather never went south of Elizabeth, New Jersey for the rest of his life. But if you talk about the Elaine riots in 1919 in Arkansas, which leads the Supreme Court to begin to apply in Moore v. Dempsey in 1923, the concept that you cannot lynch people, because the Elaine riots were black sharecroppers who were attacked by white sheriffs deputized and then charged with crimes and sentenced to death. The Supreme Court said, wait a minute, this is a mass lynching. We won't participate in this. So to the extent that there is a deep historical undercurrent of our movement, and the reason I mention this is the first thing we did after the demonstration was to hold a book launch in Earl Hall of a book by Harold Cruz called The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, which had as its themes two things. One is the tension between the civil rights movement and the left, highly critical of the left, and also the intertensions between the West Indian influence and the other influences in the civil rights movement, as well as the relationship of Garvey, Du Bois, and others, and how that was affecting events and thoughts in 1960, and from his point of view, distorting that phase of the civil rights movement. So our sense of historical relationship was even then a simmering factor and something we had been talking about for years that led to our cohesion. And I'm saying that you can extend the historical memory back further. I'm not really disagreeing with
There's a
you.
historical continuity
Right.
in the experience of the equality movement in
Right.
America that the white radicals
Right.
did not have.
Except
we had a
that it
disruptive
was there
history.
for them. The Red Scare, at the same time my grandfather was being run out of Florida by a lynch mob, we had the Red Scare and the Palmer raids. So it was historically there. I have no way of knowing whether it was being explored on the white left. All I can say is that there was a historical resonance that goes back really to the beginning of the century.
I think if you are the people who have to sit in the back of the bus, if you are the people who are being lynched, that history's alive in your bones in a way it couldn't be.
You've always
for
called it
most
double
white
consciousness.
people.
It's double consciousness. You're right.
That's right.
Yeah. But then it's interesting that in this year of the 50th anniversary, I am surprised because by now, well, actually some of the bitterness is still there. At each of these events that I've been to, this might be my last event, I don't know if you can call this an event, gathering fatigue with you fine gentlemen, is that white students continually say, why did you ask us to leave? Which is interesting, and I was correctly criticized for saying it's hurt feelings. There's something else there about the act of our saying, we're ready for this, and we don't think you are, follow our lead. But that has come across as something else, and I know a number of students, especially more white women students from that period, have a sense of resentment at the dynamic that's set in place, which had some negative components. And I don't fully understand it because we're at peace with it as a strategic move. It was not.
Do you, Todd, understand this? I mean, what?
You mean the women resentment by women?
Not just
Yeah,
women, but
and
by
the
the white
white-
students have said,
Yeah, well-
we're angry that you asked us to leave.
Yes, I do. I
And-
think I do understand it. The white movement of which SDS was central was pivoted on the civil rights movement. Civil rights movement is the beginning of the new left. And what that means is that from the very beginning of the white left in the 60s reincarnation of the white left, black people are accorded respect as not only suffering persons, but as leaders. So to be told now in 1968 that this may seem, you STS people, this may seem to be your show. You're animated about the war and about the Institute for Defense Analyses, but you know what? Push comes to shove. We are ready, as you said, we're prepared. You're not. Yeah. We have concrete demands. We have this historical
it's hard to take that in.
And the white people don't want to be told. I wouldn't want to be. I wouldn't not have wanted to be told in 1968. You people are you student revolutionaries. You're pursuing a will-o'-the-wisp.
Right, but that
you're
was,
pursuing
that was
a
the
delusion.
radical thing to do. But I also wanted to add this dimension, since many of the white students, right, disproportionately were Jewish, and were also from families of Holocaust survivors. What sort of mentality and red diaper babies?
It's in there. It's
in there. How does that play
so
off?
So the
on
New
all
Left
this?
from the very beginning, whether the students were Jewish or not, we were still close enough to World War II
right.
to know what barbarism, what genocidal barbarism humanity is capable of.
Okay.
And it was haunting. It was haunting to know that this had happened, you know, in the lifetimes of parents, but also ourselves. And so
you felt that
one of
too.
the
Were you
I
raised
felt it very
within
much,
that context? Yeah.
And so, you know, it was very early in the 60s, you start hearing a rhetoric. We're not going to be the good Germans. We're not going to be the Germans who are standing by. And I still remember a moment, I was doing community organizing in Chicago in the mid-60s. An article appeared in one of the Chicago papers. It was datelined on a train through Germany. And the reporter writes, I'm on this train, I sit next to a guy, he says to me, "Are you an American?" I say, "Yes." The guy says, "I want to tell you a story because you will understand." And then the guy tells a story about some wartime atrocity, some anti-Jewish atrocity he was involved in. I read this and it gave me the shivers, it still gives me the shivers. You're an American now, you're involved in this horrendous war, you will understand what it was like to be a Nazi. I mean, that was a kind of moral tremor that went through you. So I think that was alive. It was especially alive for Jews, but not only. I don't know that the movement at Columbia was any more Jewish than the student body, by the way. I don't know that it was or wasn't. I mean, certainly Columbia was quite Jewish in general. So.
Right. But again, I wonder what sort of interaction was going on there as another dimension of this struggle and understanding what the black students were going through. Shouldn't have been a natural sort of
I think the revolutionary spirit that was alive warps your ability to see widely. So why it would
what does that mean?
Why it would be that, for example, you would be at pains to work things out with the cops, not because you love the cops, but because you're into survival. You don't want to trigger a massacre. Okay,
Right.
I mean, maybe I wasn't there at the time, but I've been in comparable situations. I think maybe the white students didn't, as we would say now, get it. Did not
And there were
get.
some whispers of criticism after we were arrested without anybody being harmed.
That's right. We got beaten up.
Right.
How come you guys got
That's
privileged
ridiculous.
treatment?
That's totally ridiculous.
But it's I can understand.
It's
the
understandable.
And the cops had a different attitude. The cop who arrested me, or at least who took down my information at the station house, he's typing it up, and I'm doing name, rank, signal now, and I'm not talking to him, and he says, "I can understand you colored kids being angry. What's wrong with these white kids who have this wonderful opportunity?" So even on the police, but the truth is that the cop who led our arrests was Deputy Chief Eldred Waite, who we had met with 6 months earlier, not in anticipation of this, but to learn about demonstrations. He was anxious to talk to us because we were saying we're nonviolent, we want to demonstrate, but we sure don't want to get our heads beat in. So we had taken pains to study that, counterinsurgency doctrine, and there were a host of other, even our take on the war was different.
So thank you again, Todd and Ray, for an incredible show. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. This is Jim Vrettos. We look forward to seeing you again next week on The Radical Imagination. We're going to go out with the Grateful Dead at Columbia University, followed by a short clip of Reverend William Barber the Poor People's Campaign. And those of you who are interested in what we've been talking about this past hour, there's a new book out called A Time to Stir, Columbia in 1968 by Paul Cronin. Pick it up in your bookstores. It's an incredible book. So thank you once again so much for watching us here on The Radical Imagination. Jim Vredos, see you again next week.
Justice is like running a relay. You run your circle, and then you pass the baton. Martin is not getting up out of the grave. We must be the runner in front that reaches back.
Dr. King was a man for the people, you know. One of the last things that he worked on was the Poor People's Campaign. We have an obligation to keep that going. And I think there's a lot of Dr. Kings like all over the country.
Poor People's Campaign was trying to make sure that people had a decent standard of living no matter where they were in this country. The work of Dr. King clearly isn't finished.
As a veteran that swore an oath to this country, to serve this country. To see so many people in poor and desperate situations, to see racism rising again in America, it hurts. But witnessing the unity of people from all walks of life, we're going to eventually win. We can't not win.
They never told us to keep honoring their work. They told us, continue it. That's why we got to have a Poor People's Campaign. People will denounce what happened in Charlottesville, the death, the person running through the crowd, and say, I'm not like him. But just because you're not like that person does not mean that you're not embracing the values of white nationalism and white supremacists. People in this country want to deal with race real quickly. We never want to probe it and deal with it. We want to just kind of say that's them. And one of the things I think we have to do is understand that. To denounce hate is not necessarily to denounce white supremacy. If statues come down, racism can still be up. There are a lot of those who think that racism is merely about personal interaction. So if they have a black friend or brown friend, then they say, I'm not racist. In actuality, that is not what systemic racism is. What I'm concerned the most about this Trump administration is the way in which he openly used white rage, racism, and hatred.
These are animals.
Now, I have to say it is not new. He's not the first one to use it. It's as American as apple pie. Many of these statues that are now the focus of attention were placed between 1898 and 1922, which means they were not so much celebrating the Civil War, they were celebrating the return of codified white supremacy in the law. They were celebrating the return of an open white supremacist in the White House, Woodrow Wilson, who played Birth of a Nation, the Klansman, in the Oath of Office to all of his staff and directed them to end desegregation of the federal government. When those statues were commissioned and put up, they were done to say the white supremacy is back. When those statues were put up, every black member of the United States Congress had been removed. Segregation was legalized constitutionally. Every member of the Supreme Court voted on it except one. You have to understand that to understand why the white nationalists and white supremacists chose Charlottesville. By going there and saying, you're not going to touch this statue and we're going to protect it, they were saying, we can now once again celebrate that we have a sympathizer. And the president has shown he's a sympathizer with his inability to be clear. What precipitated the rise and the boldness of white nationalism and white supremacists in this particular moment was not merely Trump talking ugly, it was the policy direction, the mean-spiritedness and that lined up with the policy directives of white nationalism. That's what's really going on. It's not then just the statue, it's the statutes, it's the law, which means that people of conscience must, yes, challenge the statutes, but we cannot stop there. We have to challenge the way in which the policies of white supremacy and white nationalism is flowing through our state capitals and many policies in our United States Congress, but it doesn't sound like white supremacy. But the impact is that the laws have a disparate racial impact upon black people, brown people, and guess what? Hurt also more poor whites and working class whites. So our protests must be strategic, must be long-term. What we have to do now is, while we march to denounce hate, we're going to have to march to the voting booths, and we're going to have to march on Congress and state capitals. And we're going to have to say to politicians, if you say that you denounce white supremacy in its most violent forms, that, like what happened in Charlottesville, do you denounce the policies that precipitate that kind of violence and that embolden white nationalists? So we need to take the policy agenda of the white nationalist organization, where do they stand on health care, where do they stand on voting rights, where do they stand on equal protection under the law, where do they stand on Muslims, where do they stand on LGBT people. The death of that young girl traumatizes me in the nation. You cannot push back against that with just every now and then having a rally. You have to have a long-term movement that names the issues and then challenges them with a deep moral argument, not just a political argument. There is a moral movement rising in this country that is saying Dr. King is dead, Faneuil Hamer is dead, Rabbi Heschel is dead, Dorothy Day is dead, Harriet Tubman is dead, Elizabeth Cady Stanton is dead, Frederick Douglass is dead, but we are their children, and it is time now for us to raise our moral dissent. It is time for us to believe in our moral dreams, and it is time for us to be the moral defibrillators that revive the heart of this country.